Stewart. I am the communications coordinator for the New Hampshire Food Alliance, and you are at our October Network Café, part of our 2023-2024 Network Café series. We hold these network cafes every Friday of the month, September through April, and generally they're really informal conversations with our partners in New Hampshire, but also across our food system and other states as well. Network cafes are just one part of our work here at the Food Alliance, but overall we're a statewide network. We're coordinated by the Sustainability Institute at UNH, and we engage and connect people dedicated to growing a thriving, fair, and sustainable local food system here in the Granite State. A couple acknowledgements before we get started with our presentation for the day. As a program of UNH, we always like to do our land acknowledgement and our DEI acknowledgement at the beginning of each of our events. So I'm going to read a little bit from that. You can view the full land, water, and life acknowledgement on our agenda for today for UNH. So the University of New Hampshire is committed to building and nurturing an environment of inclusive excellence where all can thrive. We, as the New Hampshire Food Alliance, join UNH in its belief that diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion are foundational values inextricably linked to achieving our core educational mission and embracing the many characteristics of our community members that make them uniquely themselves. As part of UNH's and the New Hampshire Food Alliance's values of diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, we would like to read, I'm going to read a little bit part of the UNH Land, Water, and Life Acknowledgement. As we all journey on the trail of life, we wish to acknowledge the spiritual and physical connection the Pennacook, Abenaki, and Wabanaki peoples have maintained to Indokina, homeland, which the University of New Hampshire community is honored to steward today. One more thing before I pass it to Nicole to give us a little framing for our presentation for the day. We have some desired outcomes as well as community working agreements on our agenda for all of these network cafes. It's a great way to set your expectations for what is going to go on today. So I will let Nicole take it from there, but feel free to put questions and thoughts in the chat as we start our presentation for the day.
Thanks, Colleen. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on this beautiful Friday. So during this year's Network Café series, most of you know, since you registered, we're focusing on a regional approach to food system resilience. And I'm going to try to explain this in a nutshell so that you know, have some context for what we're talking about today. So the New England Food System Planners Partnership is a really unique partnership. It's made up of the 6 state networks in New England and in collaboration with Food Solutions New England. And this spring, that partnership was joined by designated representatives from each of the 6 New England state agricultural agencies as well, which we're really excited to share. This past May, the group released a report of foundational data called A Regional Approach to Food System Resilience. It's a lot to take in for all of us. It's 4 volumes and an executive summary. It's hundreds of pages, countless data sets. And so as the New Hampshire Food Alliance, we decided the most helpful thing we could do for our network was to help you all access and understand what data this report offers so that you can use it however is helpful to you in your work, which was the whole intention of it. So this September, Ellen Kaler, the executive director for the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, came and kicked off the series by explaining the partnership, the New England Feeding New England project, and giving an overview of the executive summary. And if you missed that, the recording is available on the website. And this month, I'm very excited to be welcoming Brian Donohue, who led the research team for volume number 1, which is titled Estimating Resilient Eating Patterns. So because at a basic level, how I like to think of the New England Feeding New England project is this. It was asking, what are we producing as a region in New England? And what are we eating as New Englanders? And then where do those two things overlap? And how might they overlap more in the future? And so Brian led the research team trying to us to start to address that question. Colleen, will you go to the next slide, please? And the New England Feeding New England project used the New England Food Vision, which has a goal of 50% local food by 2060, and came up with a number that was an interim step on the journey towards that. So the project looked at 30% local food or regional food by 2030. And Brian will get into that a bit more. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Brian, and we've asked him to take 15 to 20 minutes to answer 3 questions for you. Who was on this research team that you led? What were they tasked with doing? And can you show us the most meaningful or interesting handful of charts or data sets to come out of your work, in your opinion? So he's going to answer those questions for us, and then have lots of time to answer your questions about the data, the implications of it, and whatever else you come up with. Thank you, Brian. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Nicole and Colleen. I will do my best. Hello, everyone. Yes, I was also a co-author of the New England Food Vision, and I should say that I'm not a nutritionist. I'm an environmental historian, but I think because of my experience with these data sets and getting consumption to relate to production may have been why Ellen asked me to take on this particular task. I also worked on the production team, and I want to get into that a little bit. So next slide, please, Colleen. So as Nicole said, that this is the overall goal of the project, was to ascertain whether we could produce 30% of our of the food we eat from within New England. Go ahead. Next. Oh, do you want to say something about that, Nicole?
Just that, thanks, Brian. Just that the NEFNI project, the partnership is starting to release state briefs, and the New Hampshire state brief is available. It's available on their website. It'll be available on our website any day. And we'll send it out after this, with this recording, to all of you. So take a look at that if you're interested to see some of the New England-wide data, as well as some data specific to New Hampshire.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and one of the most interesting things about this, just as an aside, is that it's a regional vision, but there's of course 6 states, and the position of the 6 states within the region are quite different. The northern New England states and the southern New England states sort of have are in very different positions regarding who consumes most of the food and who produces most of it. So anyway, this is the research team, or maybe it's on 2 slides. No, maybe it's just on 1 slide. So there we all are. Yeah. And you're going to hear from some of the other team leaders who are up there at the top, I think, in forthcoming presentations. So next slide. We also had an advisory committee. You probably know some of these folks from around the region that we checked in with every few months as we worked through this process to get feedback on where we were going and what we ought to keep our eye on. So that's those folks. Next. Okay, key findings. I'm not going to go into these in depth, but they're in the executive summary. And so volume 1, could we produce more of our food within the region if we in a healthier, more resilient way? That's an interesting question. What is the hostess spotlight? No, go up, back, please. And then, so I'll be talking to that one. Chris Peters in a month will be talking to volume 2. Could we meet that goal of 30%? Volume 3 and 4 will be coming up after that, and I'm not going to say anything about them today, except do we have the right mix of industries and what market channels offer the best opportunity? Those are the real bottlenecks when you come down to it. Yeah, we could in theory produce more food, but how would we process it? How would we get it to flow through the market as it exists? And I think the bottom line is that will take a great deal of intervention by us as a society if we want to move in this direction. Okay, next slide. So that's our volume 1. And the researchers who worked particularly on this volume, there were 4 of us. So there was me, there was Laura Barley, who's now doing farm viability for the state of Massachusetts at Massachusetts Agricultural Resources. But at the time we were doing the work, she was at American Farmland Trust. There was Scott Richardson. He is a nutritionist, and he's his partner in Northbound Ventures. And then Sarah Amin, and Sarah is assistant professor of community nutrition at the University of Rhode Island. So she's very deep into this stuff. So that was our group. Our job was really to provide the production team with some kind of sense of what we might be eating in New England in 2030 so that they could do their regional self-reliance calculations. We needed to provide them with some kind of level of consumption, so they could figure out, how would that compare to what's being produced. So that was our basic job. We looked at some trends of how people's eating has been changing over time. Oh, I should say we had to do this from national data. There's no specific New England data that we could find to use to say just so. The assumption here is that people in New England eat more or less like people across the country. That may not be exactly true, but close enough for our purposes. We looked at some trends over time. You may know some of them. We're drinking less milk, or eating more cheese, those sorts of things, but we didn't see any way to really project those out to 2030 in a way that made a lot of sense. So we decided the thing to do would be to provide the production team with two ends of a spectrum for their calculations. And one end would be, well, what if we continue to eat just about as we are eating today? And the other end of the spectrum would be, well, what if we ate in a different way that looked a lot more like the USDA dietary guidelines? And probably where we end up will be somewhere between those two. So that would give the production team a way of kind of pegging two ends of the question, rather than for us to come up with some fancy projection. Okay, so we called the one end unchanged eating, and we called the other end resilient eating. And Colleen, why don't you go ahead? I want to just say this, or even just about read this second part about what we mean by resilient eating. An important element in overall regional food system resilience. It goes beyond increased regional self-reliance and production by sustainable methods. It must ensure food security for everyone. So it's healthier eating plus improved access, greater food and nutrition security, support for local and regional food systems, all that. It reduces vulnerability, and it's tied to community food security and empowerment. And I think this is really important. This goes back to the food vision as well, that food justice is really at the center of all this. It doesn't do a lot of good to talk about how much food we could produce or how people could eat in a healthier way if people don't have the means to do that. So in order to make progress in any of these directions, the heart of it has to be that we have food access to healthy food so that people can eat in the way they would like to eat. And I'll circle back to that, but I wanted to put that in there at the outset. So go on. We also, as we did our work, we convened a review panel of nutritionists, mostly from around the region, but also from around the country, to review what we were coming up with and give us guidance. And they really did. And I'll talk to a couple specific ways in which they modified what we were up to. So that was very helpful. Next, please. Get to this. All right. So let's start with unchanged eating. What we did there was to use, this is very straightforward, to use USDA, ERS, food availability data that's loss adjusted. Some of you may know that looks at how much food disappears into the US food distribution system, and then takes calculations of how much of it disappears that is lost at various steps along the way to come up with numbers of how much food is being consumed. It isn't precise, but it's been used for a long time and gives a reasonably accurate picture of what the average person is consuming in a way of all these different food groups and of the total calories consumed and so forth. So that was, again, we judged that to be close enough for our purposes to use. We checked it against NHANES, and some of you may know that's the National Health and Nutrition Education Survey, I think is what it stands for. That is survey data where people report what they actually eat over a period of time. And those two sources look pretty similar, quite similar actually, except in a couple places, people tend to report they eat fewer calories than the ERS data indicates they are. We don't really know which one is correct. And people also report that they eat a little less meat than the food availability data indicates they do. So there were some differences, but we checked with our panel, and the bottom line was that the ERS data is consistent, works well with the production data, and is close enough. Again, with these kinds of exercises, you can't be perfectly precise. You're trying to give a general ballpark figure. Could you go back to the other slide for just a second? Sorry. So then that was one end of our spectrum. The other end, resilient eating, we followed, again, USDA dietary guidelines, and as to what the population of New England, as it will be in 2030, would be eating if they were to follow those guidelines. When we did that calculation, it actually came out to a consumption level, average consumption level across the whole population of 2,100 calories. And we judged, and our panel of nutritionists insisted that that was unreasonably low, that that would be unattainable by 2030, given the way people are eating today. So we came up to a 2,300 calorie level, which is still pretty ambitious. And the reason you need to specify a calorie level is because that allows you to look at the dietary guidelines and get to servings in the different food groups. And it was really servings that we needed to deliver to the production team. How many servings per day on average is a person in New England going to be eating of dairy, of meat, of protein, of fruits and vegetables, and so forth? That was what they would need for their calculations. So we ended up at 2,300 calories to give our estimates to the production team. Okay. Next, please. So basically, what would that mean? What would the difference look like between unchanged eating and what we call resilient eating? And none of these will surprise you. The biggest changes is it would mean we'd be eating a lot, on average, a lot more fruit, twice as much, half again as many vegetables, 3 servings instead of 2 servings per day on average. Now, dairy, we left that the same. The dietary guidelines actually call for more dairy consumption, but no nutritionist that I know actually supports that. So we left it where it was, which is what, for example, the Harvard Healthy Plate does. Protein is quite interesting. If you follow USDA dietary guidelines, the amount of animal protein recommended actually comes down quite a bit. Seafood goes up, but other meats come down, and nuts and beans go up. So that's the change you would see if we move from unchanged eating towards what we call resilient eating. More seafood, more beans and nuts, less red meat. Actually, they recommend more seafood than we thought New England waters could reasonably produce. So we cut that back a little bit. Just again, because we thought it was be fine if people wanted to eat more seafood, but it couldn't be produced within our region. Grains would stay about the same, but more whole grain. And then, of course, there would be big decreases basically in processed food, in sweeteners and in fats and oils. So that's the difference, again, between these two ends of the spectrum of what we might be consuming in 2030. Our best guess is that where people are actually eating, again, as an average across the whole population, will be somewhere in between. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. This is a question that might arise is, okay, you know, it would be great if we were eating more like this resilient eating pattern. what would it cost for a person to eat that way, or for a household to eat that way? We wanted to tackle that question. And so we took a swing at it. And this slide gets at some of the work we did for that. As you may know, the U.S. Labor Bureau publishes annual consumer expenditure surveys that lay out how much Americans are spending on food on average, and actually in the different wealth quintiles, because as you earn more money, you spend more on food. And they divide that into the different food groups. So, and you see those in the left-hand column, that 16% of what Americans spend on food is spent on vegetables. This is food that's purchased at home, actually. They don't make these distinctions within the money that people spend when they eat out. But still, it gives you an idea. Fruits, 15% of expenditures. Proteins, 34% is a big one, and one that's not being shown there is actually other, which is mostly, again, processed food, and that's also something like 35%. So people are spending a lot on those kinds of foods. Well, since we had the data on what people are consuming from ERS, and we knew how much that would change in terms of servings to get to resilient eating, we could apply those ratios to the consumer expenditure survey and see what you see in the right-hand column. As you see, the percentage of money that would be spent on vegetables and fruits goes up considerably, and proteins come down a bit, though, and dairy and grains, a little bit of change. The other big change would be that the expenditure on other foods would come way down. Well, the next step is that our resilient eating pattern closely resembles USDA's recommended food plans. And as some of you may know, they have 4 of them: the Thrifty Food Plan, and the Low Cost, and the Moderate, and the Liberal. And each one has a similar nutritional profile, but allows for more expenditure on food. And the Thrifty Food Plan is the one that's used to calculate SNAP benefits. So as you can see, if you look at those expenditures, they're quite similar to what's in resilient eating. Somehow they find a lot of low-cost fruit. I'm not quite sure how they do that. But at any rate, the bottom line here is that to eat something like the resilient eating diet could be done for the same cost roughly as USDA's Thrifty Food Plan, which is about $10,000 a year for a household of 4. And they do that by greatly reducing the expenditures on other foods and making those other shifts that you see. So that's interesting. It says that would be possible for the average American, if they were very disciplined and ate at home, to eat a diet such as is laid out in resilient eating. It also says that the lower first and second quintiles, who are below the mean, could not afford that. And so it drives home the point to me that, again, that if we think it's desirable that we move in the direction of this kind of eating, we have to make it possible for people to be able to do that. Vermont, by the way, uses the moderate food plan in their calculations of what could provide a decent living, and that runs about $12,600 a year for a family of 4. So somewhere in that range is what we're trying to get to, is what it would cost for us to follow the resilient eating pattern. Okay, next slide, please. I thought I would give you a sneak preview of what Chris will be talking about next month as to what all this means for production and how much of that production could take place in New England. Because again, that was really the purpose of our work, was just to get to this. And I was part of this work, and it's actually closer to the kind of thing I'm most familiar with. So I thought, if you'll indulge me, I'd just look at a little bit of this. So next slide. This is one way of looking at how much food is being produced in New England in some of these major food groups, just about all of them, compared to consumption. And this uses pounds as its metric, which is one way you can do it. One of the difficulties of this work is that working across all these different food groups to figure this out, you have to have some kind of common measure. It could be calories, it could be pounds of food, it could be servings, as we're trying to get to. In the New England Food Vision, we actually used acres. How many acres would it take to produce these various dietary patterns? So this is pounds, and in pounds today, if you sum it all up, New England's producing 20 or 21% of its food. Okay, but you can see that by using pounds, we give an enormous advantage to dairy because milk is heavy. So in a way, this is a misleading way of looking at the thing. But all of these different measures are misleading in some way, and you just sort of have to know what they are. So because New England produces a lot of our own dairy, and dairy is a huge amount of the total poundage, we look pretty good. Actually, in vegetables, we look pretty decent, but a lot of that is potatoes. So it's, in a way, the same kind of objection. I wanted to look at this slide for just a second to tell you what we actually then did, and Chris will explain this in great detail, to try to get to the 30% number, like 30% of what? And the measure, as I was saying earlier, that we decided to use was servings. How much of the servings of each of these food groups of dairy, so many a day as we were just looking at, could we produce within the region? And we did one other thing to try to get to 30%, which is a desperately hard climb. We decided to forget about fats and oils and sweeteners. I think for the best word for this is cheating. We sort of said, heck, we're not going to be able to produce very much of those probably. Let's focus on the things that we really maybe could grow here and that would make a lot of sense to grow here if we could grow more of them, and see if we could get to 30% of servings of that.
Brian,
yes.
Can you explain during the last Network Café series, there was some confusion about regional self-reliance, that RSR score. Will you just briefly explain that to the group?
So yeah, that's a simple percentage. If you look at some measure of how much of something we eat, dairy, for example, in this case, we're seeing it in pounds, and then you look at how much of that we produce within the region, that percentage is our regional self-reliance. It's a net balance calculation. It can't really tell us whether some of what we produce is flowing out of the region and so on. It just kind of looks at what we produce within that group and what we consume and compares them. And again, if you use different metrics, calories or pounds or dollars, you get different answers. And they're all meaningful in their own way. And we settled on servings. Does that help?
It does, yes. I think what I just want to emphasize for folks is that it's not that we are eating for 50%, 44% of our dairy from New England farms. It's that in theory, side by side, that's how much dairy we're producing, that's how much dairy we're consuming. And so if you compare them, right, theoretically, we could be 44% regionally self-reliant.
Right, and there's no easy way to track the actual flows. We looked into that, but the data on that are just impossible. But sure, there's cheese that we're making in New England that's leaving, and there's cheese that's coming from other parts of the world that we're eating. So we're just looking at a simple net balance calculation. Quite right. Okay, so let's say here's the goal. We're going to try to get, we made it a little easier for ourselves, but it's also where we ought to be focusing. We're going to try to get to 30% of the servings of dairy, vegetables, fruits, proteins, and grains by 2030. Can we do that? And if you'll give me the next slide, and Chris will explain this at great length, and the answer is, yeah, kind of maybe, but it's a heavy lift. So the top slide there shows you the acreage that's in agriculture in New England today and the broad categories of what it's producing. And you'll see perennial forages, so a lot of it's hay. You see vegetables and fruits quite small. You will see in the bottom left, this is of the top rectangle, something called pasture cover ungrazed, which is 400,000 acres. That's really interesting. That is land that can be seen in remote sensing kind of land cover data analysis, 500,000 acres almost, that's out there that the agricultural census doesn't know about. It's not showing up in the ag census, which only has about 1.7 million acres in New England that are in actual agricultural production. So we don't really know what that is, but it's just probably a lot of open fields that belong to people who aren't farming it or brush hogging it, that sort of thing. It's an untapped resource. Tapping it may not be an easy thing to do, but it's out there. So then if you go down, that shows you the amount of acreage that it would take to actually realize the 30%. 30% of the top 5 food groups as measured by servings. In the regional eating, in the resilient eating scenario, by the way, it would take a little bit, a couple 100,000 acres less to do it in the unchanged eating one. Now you can see what the big changes are. A lot more acreage gets devoted to vegetables and fruits. That's the first thing, and to grains for that matter. And then in order to do that and still have plenty of livestock production in the system for the dairy and protein, you have to come up with additional land. And essentially that is that pasture cover ungrazed category, which now sort of joins the pasturage and forage side of the ledger. And you would need another 500,000 acres more than that that's currently under trees. That's what it would take. There is that much prime ag soil in New England that's under trees. It's out there. It was in production as late as something like 1945. Whether or not we really want to go out and get it is a question that we as a society will have to be deciding over the next several decades. And one of the most important questions in all this is, and who decides? Who's at the table to make these sorts of decisions? Right now, these decisions are being made by the market. They're being made by the real estate market, and they're being made by the market in commodities, in food commodities. And I think just to kind of close up here, the bottom line of our project is this is doable. You can sketch out how it could be done, but it will not happen on its own. And it will not happen just from us wanting it to happen. It will happen because we have governments mainly who decide to commit resources to tipping the market in this direction. That would be my analysis of where this all leads. So I think I'm out of stuff to just ramble on about. And let's talk about it.
Thank you so much, Brian. We have one question in the chat so far. I think I'll pause for a second and say, if you have questions, please add them to the chat or feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask it. The question we have here is, do you have ideas on changing food preferences from processed to whole foods? That seems to be a mindset shift on a large scale.
I do have thoughts on that, and I'm sure a lot of other folks on this call have more experience than I do. The bottom line to me is people have to have enough resources so that they have a chance to do that. That we're talking about a long-term changes in the way people eat that do happen gradually. I'm an agricultural historian, and if you look at the way Americans eat over time, it does change. But for people to do this, they have to be able to afford it. They have to be able to afford it. They have to, and it has to be presented in ways and reinforced in ways that are relevant to their communities. It takes a big long-term kind of effort to make this possible. And other things go along with it. Affordable housing goes along with it, right? Access to affordable healthcare goes along with it. You can't really see it, just say, hey, folks, here's the way you all ought to be eating, and expect people to be able to move in that direction without really making a strong societal effort to support that. That would be my, and then people will move in the way they want to move and are able to move under those circumstances.
Thank you. Representative Bixby, do you have a question? Comment?
Yeah, I actually have a couple of questions. One that are not tightly related, but I'll shoot them out. So, one is there any measure of what people produce in home gardens and in backyard chickens, etc., incorporated into these data?
Okay, let's start with that. So, not directly. And that is really hard to find out. I used to teach a food and agriculture class. I'm emeritus now, but I always had a student who would tackle that. And boy, those data are really hard to find. But people are doing that. And I guess my answer to you is the more people do that, the better. That's a very legitimate and important part of how we might be able to move in this direction. Whether it be in their own backyards or in community gardens and so forth, those ways of producing, and it's mostly vegetables, but to some extent it's other things as well, are very empowering and help drive change, the other kinds of changes that it would take for this to happen.
Right. So essentially, those aren't in the measurements, but they're good things to do.
Well, I think they're in the measurements, but they're just hidden.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the second question is in terms of the cropland, the cropland, the grazing land necessary. Have you looked into the possibility of using silvopasture as a way of reducing the amount of land that would actually need to be cleared?
Well, I've certainly been part of those conversations. So you could look at that acreage, the additional pasture acreage, as being partly silvopasture. Sure, that sounds good. I'm not I have beef cattle, and so I've been raising animals for a long time. I'm not sure you're actually going to be able to get the same production per acre if you do silvopasture, but I think there are people who claim that you can. But even if you can't, you may be getting a better combination overall. So to me, it's a great part of all those agroforestry things are a great way we might one of the ways we might be able to do that in our part of the world.
I think there's some research at UNH that indicates that the production of meat itself or dairy itself drops off a bit, but it also allows the possibility of having other tree crops that would be sort of using the same land.
Right. Yeah. And you maybe get more carbon benefits and a lot of other stuff. I mean, I'm all for it. My only caveat here is that I've been for it for 50 years. I mean, we've been talking about this as long as I've been part of this conversation, which is half a century, and I haven't seen much of it yet. So I want to see it out there before we start cranking in, but yeah, I'm totally for it.
Okay, I'm going to chime in with some questions from the chat here. One of them is, what if we ate far less meat and far less dairy? The question is, what would the required acreage be? Of course, that's a fuzzy question there. But do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I think it would come down some more. It is far less meat, and it's not far less dairy. That's true, but it is quite a bit less meat. And in the New England Food Vision, we took meat down by 2/3, but we brought it all to New England and put it on pasture. So I think part of the answer is, yeah, if you wanted to run this instead of with the USDA diet or with a version of the USDA dietary guidelines that was more vegetarian or more vegan, I think you could bring the total acreage needed down. One of the problems you would have would be finding the right acreage in New England, because New England is not heavy on really good cropland. But we got a lot of very decent, rockier, but still productive pasture land. So it would be an interesting exercise. My gut feeling is you probably get closer to regional self-reliance if you could get a very large part of the population to eat a vegan or vegetarian diet. Sure.
Thank you, Brian. Were these calculations dependent on the thrifty food plan,
No.
or was that only provided for comparison?
There's
Lots of talk on how that's an outdated measure.
What's that?
E.g., it says there's lots of talk on how that's an outdated measure, only sensitive to food costs, not rent, other bills, etc.
Yeah, right. It's very low, and that's why Vermont uses the moderate food plan. But the nutritional profiles of the different food plans are very similar. And no, the calculations weren't based on it. It was something that we brought in at the end to try to get a sense of what the resilient eating pattern might cost. And as I sort of said, you could do it on the thrifty food plan, but man, you could never eat out. You'd have to be incredibly disciplined. So the moderate food plan would probably be more like it. So you'd be at 12,600 for a family of 4 instead of 10,000. I think that's kind of what you're getting at. But I will say it's great that they revised the thrifty food plan a couple of years ago and brought those SNAP benefits up. That was long overdue, and I think they're doing it with the other food plans as well.
I'm going to keep going because now the questions are starting to flow in. It's great. So this, I think, is related to what you just said. How might changing habits to waste less food affect how much we need to grow? Was that part of these calculations, or is the assumption we'll continue to waste the same amount of food as accounted for in the USDA baseline numbers?
I think the assumption, I think we punted on waste. Press Chris Peters on that in a month. I'm trying to remember. In theory, we could waste a lot less food. I think there are a couple things to say about that. One is that what that might mostly mean is that we do a much better job of recycling it and keeping it from going into landfills. So we at least get it back as fertilizer, compost. That would be a great thing. As far as less waste, that's mostly plate waste in our society. I mean, there's some at the point of production. If you've ever run a vegetable farm, and I have, you will know that an awful lot of vegetables get left right on the farm because they just kind of get graded out, and people who do gleaning and so forth try to recover some of that. So probably there's some, if we added processing capacity, we could grab more of that. And we had a nice focus group on the production team where we talked to people who do processing and sort of thought about that. So yeah, we didn't put that in the calculations, but ask Chris more about that, because he did put increased yields in the calculations, and in a sense, capturing more of that and using it at the farm would be a better yield. But most waste is actually plate waste. It's what gets thrown out of your refrigerator, and how does that really change? I'm not sure. I mean, it's great to talk about, but.
Thank you. Okay, well, let's see. The next one. Do you have a sense of how much of existing underutilized cropland is owned by educational institutions, or is it on local, state, or federal land, or a sense of how much this underutilized cropland is under consideration for zoning changes that would make it unavailable for agriculture?
Well, or just from being owned by people who don't really have much interest in using it agriculturally, except maybe a couple of horses. Yeah, really press Chris on that one. And he might have a better sense, but I think the bottom line is we really don't know. No one has really gone out and tried to figure out what all that is. It's more than just people's backyards. It's pretty big chunks of open fields. And so I do not have a sense of how much of it is institutional, but I think probably most of it is private. And so I do think about that a lot, because I co-own with friends what you might call a hobby farm. I mean, we do produce beef cattle. So I think about ways that you could get some of that land into production. I don't know, people ran cow-calf operations there and cut their hay late for bobolinks and did nice stuff like that. And then the calves went off to finishers. If we really wanted to do this as a society, there might be ways we could lure some of that land back into back into production. But it does get at another question, which someone's about to ask, so I might as well. Yeah, why don't other people have access to land? One of the biggest problems we have is that we have lots of particularly young people and diverse range of people from all backgrounds who would love to get out there and farm and produce more of this food, but they can't get access to land in New England. It's so expensive. So we really need programs working through land trusts, and of course, many of them are, to figure out ways to make that land available, not just for some beef cattle, but for growing fruits and vegetables and so forth. Again, it's those kinds of things that are really going to be needed to move any distance toward the New England Food Vision or 30 by 30. It's just not going to happen on its own. We really have to push for those sorts of policy initiatives.
You know, speaking of that, this question, I'm curious to hear your answer to. Would moving subsidies for commodities to sustainable regional food programs cover the cost or much of them? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, sure. If we moved, yeah, if we subsidized in different ways, and Union of Concerned Scientists did a great little study on that 5 or 10 years ago that I used to assign in class. So no question, if we could shift the subsidies around and put more of it into this direction, it would help hugely. I don't think what's in the Farm Bill, that would be enough to really cover enough food access for everyone. And I would love to have someone do a follow-up study, to what I just hinted at today, and try to work that number out, because I think that would be the single largest step I think we could take would be to make sure, through whatever combination of a decent living wage and better SNAP and healthy incentive benefits and all the rest of that, of a good diet, however they want to have it, available to everybody. If we did that, people would spend more money on food, and a good chunk of that could be steered, and I think would be naturally steered, towards locally and regionally produced stuff.
Thanks.
I just feel like that's step number one. Get more means in people's hands to get better food and see what they do with it.
Thank you. I'm seeing all this great chat action around food waste, and I'm loving it. That was my long pause, was because I have so much to say about that, and I'm trying to resist. So I'm going to scroll back up and ask another really good question here. I lost it. Here it is. Did the research consider the need for shelf stability of food supply for individuals who are rural or impoverished and therefore cannot refresh for stock due to income or travel limitations?
Not per se, but and maybe when Holly is on and she sort of talks about distribution channels and so forth, you should bring that question back to her. But I think I've kind of been addressing it in what I've been, talking about before.
Mm-hmm.
If people are in a set of circumstances that limits them as to, having to take 3 buses to get to a grocery store or all those sorts of things that we all know about, we're just not going to be able to achieve this. We have to break through all of those kinds of barriers.
Any other questions from the group? Scrolling up to make sure I didn't miss any. It's a great discussion, everyone. And Brian, I'm really appreciative that you got into volume 2 and spoke to that a bit. I think you're right that the data was very linked to the other, and I'm glad to have your input on it all and opinions of it all. I'm going to give another minute for more questions, and then we'll wrap up. Pauline, did I miss anything?
Oh, I think we're good.
Well, I'm glad we cleared up all the mysteries and we're ready.
We solved it. No, really, those were great questions, and I'm glad we left plenty of time for them all. And we'll be back for the next 3 series, working our way through the New England Feeding New England report, called a regional oh gosh, regional. Just give me the title,
Production.
someone.
Something to do with production.
Regional approach to food system resilience.
Thank you, Leah. Don't tell Ellen I did that.
Thanks, Leah.
And yes, please take 30 seconds to fill out the evaluation for the Network Cafe series so we can continue to make these useful and productive for you all. Thank you, Brian, for being here with us. We so appreciate your time and expertise and for all of your great work. And thank you everyone for your phenomenal questions.
Yeah, a lot of those links that Nicole just referred to are in the chat. I also want to call out something that's happening around this work between now and our next Network Cafe, which is a narrative discussion about the report and about the New England Feeding New England project, primarily for communicators in the food system, but I'm sure they wouldn't mind if you come and listen. So that is on October 11th, and the link to register for that is in the chat as well.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah, go ahead, Leah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Leah Robner. I'm the project director for New England Feeding New England. Thanks for hosting this awesome webinar with Brian today, Nicole, and Colleen. I just wanted to add that we hosted a more general overview of all of the report volumes and executive summary on September 26th. That was really fantastic, and we had a lot of probably many of you, as well as a lot of other food system stakeholders in the region join. And I just wanted to let you all know that that webinar is live on our website if you'd like to check it out. And we'll drop the link in the chat again for everybody. Hi, Caitlin.
Awesome. Thanks, Leah. All right, Nicole, are we ready to ship everybody off to their Friday?
We're ready. Everyone have a wonderful weekend, and thank you for spending your Friday lunchtime with us.
And thank you, Brian, again for being here.
Sure.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.